The territories of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the largest country in the world, covering over 22,402,200 square kilometers or 8,649,500 square miles, and spanning 11 time zones from Europe to the far east of Asia, ruled autocratically, brutally, and unchallenged by Lenin's single Communist Party of the Soviet Union for over 70 years. Capitalism versus communism to divide and conquer the post-war world. A new divided world between the rich capitalists west and the poor in the Third World socialists east. The Cold War was a period of geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies, the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, which began following World War II. Historians do not fully agree on its starting and ending points, but the period is generally considered to span the 1947 Truman Doctrine, the 12th of March 1947, to the 1991 dissolution of the Soviet Union, the 26th of December 1991. The term Cold War is used because there was no large-scale fighting directly between the two superpowers, but they each supported major regional conflicts known as proxy wars. The conflict was based around the ideological and geopolitical struggle for global influence by these two superpowers, following their temporary alliance and victory against Nazi Germany in 1945. Aside from the nuclear arsenal development and conventional military deployment, the struggle for dominance was expressed via indirect means such as psychological warfare, propaganda campaigns, espionage, far-reaching embargoes, rivalry at sports events and technological competitions such as the space race. The Western Bloc was led by the United States as well as the other First World nations of the Western Bloc that were generally liberal democratic but tied to a network of the authoritarian states, most of which were their former colonies. The Eastern Bloc was led by the Soviet Union and its Communist Party, which had an influence across the Second World and was also tied to a network of authoritarian states. The US government supported anti-communist governments and uprisings across the world, while the Soviet government funded left-wing parties and revolutions around the world. As nearly all the colonial states achieved independence in the period 1945 to 1960, they became Third World battlefields in the Cold War. The first phase of the Cold War began shortly after the end of the Second World War in 1945. The United States and its allies created the NATO military alliance in 1949 in the apprehension of a Soviet attack and termed their global policy against Soviet influence containment. The Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955 in response to NATO. Major crises of this phase included the 1948 to 1949 Berlin blockade, the 1927 to 1949 Chinese Civil War, the 1950 to 1953 Korean War, the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, the 1956 Suez Crisis, the Berlin Crisis of 1961 and the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The US and the USSR competed for influence in Latin America, the Middle East, and the decolonizing states of Africa, Asia, and Oceania. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, a new phase began that saw the Sino-Soviet split between China and the Soviet Union complicate relations within the communist sphere, while France, a Western Bloc state, began to demand greater autonomy of action. The USSR invaded Czechoslovakia to suppress the 1968 Prague Spring, while the US experienced internal turmoil from the civil rights movement and opposition to the Vietnam War. In the 1960s, 1970s, an international peace movement took root among citizens around the world. Movements against nuclear weapons testing and for nuclear disarmament took place, with large anti-war protests. By the 1970s, both sides had started making allowances for peace and security, ushering in a period of détente that saw the Strategic Arms Limitation talks and the US opening relations with the People's Republic of China as a strategic counterweight to the USSR. A number of self-proclaimed Marxist regimes were formed in the second half of the 1970s in the Third World, including Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Cambodia, Afghanistan, and Nicaragua. Détente collapsed at the end of the decade with the beginning of the Soviet-Afghan War in 1979. The early 1980s was another period of elevated tension. The United States increased diplomatic, military, and economic pressures on the Soviet Union, at a time when it was already suffering from economic stagnation. In the mid-1980s, the new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced the liberalizing reforms of glasnost, openness, around 1985, and perestroika, reorganization, around 1987, and ended Soviet involvement in Afghanistan in 1989. Pressures for national sovereignty grew stronger in Eastern Europe, and Gorbachev refused to militarily support their governments any longer. In 1989, the fall of the Iron Curtain after the Pan-European picnic and a peaceful wave of revolutions, with the exception of Romania and Afghanistan, overthrew almost all communist governments of the Eastern Bloc. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union itself lost control in the Soviet Union and was banned following an abortive coup attempt in August 1991. This in turn led to the formal dissolution of the USSR in December 1991, the declaration of independence of its constituent republics, and the collapse of communist governments across much of Africa and Asia. The United States was left as the world's sole superpower. The Cold War and its events have left a significant legacy. It is often referred to in popular culture, especially with themes of espionage and the threat of nuclear warfare. Seen here is a cartoon aptly capturing the division between the capitalist West as represented by Uncle Sam of the United States symbolized by the dollar and the proletariat, or an unskilled worker of the East symbolized by the hammer and the sickle. The Soviet Navy, in Russian, the Voyenno-Morskoy Flot SSSR, or VMF, in short, meaning the Military Maritime Fleet of the USSR, was the Naval Warfare Uniform Service branch of the Soviet Armed Forces. Often referred to as the Red Fleet, in Russian, Krasny Flot, the Soviet Navy made up a large part of the Soviet Union's strategic planning in the event of a conflict with the opposing superpower, the United States, during the Cold War period between the two countries. The Red Fleet, inherited in 1917 from the Russian Navy or Military Maritime Fleet first formed in 1696 by Tsar Peter the Great, was divided into four major fleets, the Northern, Pacific, Black Sea, and Baltic fleets, in addition to the Leningrad Naval Base, which was commanded separately. It also had a smaller force, the Caspian Flotilla, which operated in the Caspian Sea, and the Indian Ocean Squadron, which operated in the Indian Ocean and was later incorporated into the Pacific Fleet, and followed by a larger fleet, the 5th Squadron, in the Middle East. The Soviet Navy included naval aviation, naval infantry, and the coastal artillery. Thus the Soviet Navy played a large role during the Cold War from 1945 to 1991, either confronting the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in Western Europe, or power projection to maintain its sphere of influence in the North Atlantic, the Pacific, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the Indian Ocean. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Russian Federation inherited the largest part of the Soviet Navy and reformed it into the Russian Navy, with smaller parts becoming the basis for navies of the newly independent post-Soviet states. In the event of a Third World War, the Russian Navy, already in concert on military exercises with Iran and China, still have the capabilities to blockade the supply lines of her enemies, chiefly the US, NATO in the West, or the newly formed AUKUS, Australian, United Kingdom, and the United States Pacific Military Alliance, in the East. Russia in the future revived as the Red Antichrist beast as predicted in Bible prophecies, in the hands of a fierce-faced autocratic king of the North, and a despotic dictator can challenge and threaten those Western Allied forces, as it has those fleets inherited from the Soviet Union already in position in all the 5 major oceans and 30 seas of the world, with headquarter and main base in Severomorsk, Murmansk Oblast, with secondary bases elsewhere in the Greater Kola Bay area, for the Northern Fleet, in Kaliningrad, and its main base in Baltiskor, Pilau, both in Kaliningrad Oblast, and another base in Kronstadt, St. Petersburg in the Gulf of Finland, for the Baltic Fleet, in Fokino, formerly Vladivostok, with numerous facilities within the Peter the Great Gulf in Primorsky Krai, and Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky and Vilyuchinsk-Novacha Bay on the Kamchatka Peninsula in Kamchatka Krai, for the Pacific and Indian Ocean Squadron, and in Sevastopol, Feodosia, and Novorossiysk or Odessa, in the Ukraine, for the Black Sea Fleet, if it falls in the future to Russia.
Open bow doors, Captain.
Stromberg 1. You are cleared to proceed to sea. Stromberg 2. You are also cleared to proceed to sea. Follow astern.
Observe, Mr. Bund. The instruments of Armageddon.
Missile Control, this is the captain. We have a change of target. New coordinates are 03-4285-219.
Missile Control, Captain. We have a new target.
The Red T-72 tanks parade in the Red Square, Moscow. The third Rome, with the year of the October Revolution 1917 clearly displayed and seen in the background, commemorating the Red October 25th, Julian calendar, Communist Revolution or coup d'etat of 1917 and celebrated annually on November 7th in our modern Gregorian calendar. The left is the coat of arms commemorating Otechestvenaya Voyna in Russian, meaning the Patriotic War, celebrated annually on May 9th. The Great Patriotic War or Velikaya Otechestvenaya Voyna in Russian is the World War II conflict fought during the period from the 22nd of June 1941 to the 9th of May 1945 at the Eastern Front, when the Red Armies under Joseph Stalin fought back, defeated with, also the Allied help from Britain and the US at the Western Front, and finally crushed the military forces of Hitler's Nazi Germany, who had earlier invaded Russia and almost captured Moscow, its capital, almost dealing it a final death blow, or as Bible prophesied predicted that the Red Beast was seen slain as unto death and yet lives. So the Red Beast of the Soviet Union was nearly defeated or slain, with Moscow, its capital, on the verge of collapsing, and being taken by the Nazis, who were only 20 kilometers or a few miles away, but eventually it was saved by the Red Army's withdrawal tactics from the city, its scorched earth policy, and encircling her enemy, helped enormously by the early cold Russian winter to emerge victorious and become the next superpower, challenging the US and the West in the Cold War that followed in the years after World War II, or the Great Patriotic War as it is called from the Russian side. Just as Napoleon Bonaparte was defeated in the First Patriotic War when he invaded Russia in 1812, captured and burnt Moscow, and found the Russian army under Tsar Alexander I had withdrawn from the battlefields, then finally he was forced to retreat in the cold Russian winter, and France's defeat by Sixth Coalition of Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, Sweden, Spain, Portugal and other German states, with Russia as the leader, and to his forced abdication when Paris fell, eventually leading to his defeat and downfall at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. So history repeated itself. Hitler's grand plan to conquer Russia in his Operation Barbarossa in 1941, which ended in the utter defeat and fall of Nazi Germany in 1945. The coat of arms to the right is that of the Soviet land forces. The map and boundaries of Europe in 1939 was changed very drastically about 13 years later in 1949 after the end of the Second World War. It was caused by the communist expansion in Europe when the Red Beast of the Soviet Union drew up the Iron Curtain from the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania and acquired the Eastern and Central European nations of Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and Albania for itself. Those were the 7 pro-Soviet satellite states which would later join the Warsaw Pact under the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Assistance signed between them and with the Soviet Union on the 14th of May 1955 in Warsaw, the capital of Poland. This communist military pact led by the Red Beast would act as a balance of power or counterweight to the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, the military alliance of the West based in Brussels, Belgium, spearheaded and led by the United States and signed in Washington, D.C. on the 4th of April 1949. Socialist Yugoslavia under General Tito, although a communist and an ally of the USSR, chose to remain neutral and independent of Soviet Russia's control and did not join the Warsaw Pact as the 7 of the Iron Curtain countries. The Red Threat in Europe in the Cold War. The Warsaw Pact forces based mainly in East Germany and Czechoslovakia had the potential threat of overrunning the democratic nations of the West, like West Germany through the North German Plain, and from there into France through the Fulda Gap and also into Italy through the Hof Corridor. Her 7 communist socialist nations forces, excluding Albania which withdrew from the pact very early, with the Soviet Union at the head, were massively armed with Soviet tactical missiles, intercontinental bombers, T-72 Soviet-built tanks and overwhelming artillery power could easily conquer Western Europe in a blitzkrieg or a lightning-like invasion in a matter of days, if not for the counterweight military threat posed by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which acted as a deterrent, because an attack on any one nation in the Western military alliance is an attack on all of the Western democratic nations. This could lead to mad or mutual assured destruction of both the West, including the US, and the East in Europe and Soviet Russia, and so mad had held the peace in the continent for over 70 years for the Western European nations to form the European Union, to be later joined by the Eastern and Central European nations after they had cast away the chains of the Iron Curtain from them and through the EU. The eastward expansion of NATO to the present-day borders of Russia itself in the Ukraine, who is hoping to join the EU and NATO. This is the main reason for Putin's Russia invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, which he claimed as a special operation to denazify the Russian ancestors' former homeland, with Kiev as the capital.
The next subject on the agenda is the continuing mutual disarmament talks with NATO. I assume you've all read General Gogol's report. It seems very thorough.
Thank you, Comrade Chairman. I believe I expressed the opinion of everyone present that adoption of NATO proposals does not compromise our defensive position.
Comrade Chairman.
General Orlov.
General Gogol is presumptuous. He speaks for himself and others who cling to timid outdated and unrealistic policies. Must I remind you, the committee, of our overwhelming superiority over NATO forces before we give it away?
In East Germany, under my direct command, I have 31 divisions, including 11 tank divisions and another 5 in Czechoslovakia. In support, on the Russian western border are 60 divisions, including 22 tank divisions. In all, a 10-to-1 advantage. American and West German forces can field at most 10 armored divisions. The British maintain only a token force. We have played out a variety of attack strategies on the new Kuznetsov computer and find that a lightning thrust by 10 armored divisions from the north and by 5 more through Czechoslovakia lead to total victory in 5 days against any possible defense scenario.
This is absolute madness. We know where it will end. NATO will counterattack with nuclear weapons.
Never! The West is decadent and divided. It has no stomach to risk our atomic reprisals. Throughout Europe, daily demonstrations demand unilateral nuclear disarmament.
I see no reason to risk war to satisfy your personal paranoia and thirst for conquest. We must turn our energies to pressing domestic problems.
General Gogol, let me remind
Comrades,
you...
sit down.
I wish to tell
Both of
you...
you. World socialism will be achieved peaceably. Our military role is strictly defensive.
Da?
Is that understood, General Orlov? General Gogol, would you continue?
Thank you, Comrade Chairman. I will now turn to the specifics of my report.
Tell him I will be there as quickly as possible.
The Red Beast's air forces and armaments are seen here from left clockwise to right. They are the MiG-17 fighter jets, the Soviet Tu-20 Bear jet bombers, the Soviet Mi-24 Hind-D helicopter gunships. Her air force now is updated with the latest 5th-generation Sukhoi Su-57 supersonic fighter jets with precise computer missile-guided system capable of delivering multiple nuclear warheads thousands of kilometers away from targets and doing almost impossible acrobatic maneuvers and amazing stunts in aerial dogfights, and it is the pride of the Russian Federation today. The Soviet SA-6 surface-to-air defense systems, the Soviet T-54 tanks, the Soviet Antonov transport aircraft and the AKM assault rifles, which were cheap to mass-produce and easy to handle. The S-300 missile defense system used in the Syrian civil wars by Russia to deter Israeli airstrikes into Syria is also one of them, which have now been updated to S-400, S-500 and the latest S-550 missile defense system, which have been tested successfully. Red Beasts, or the Soviet-Russian Empire, the dirty work of world domination of Moscow. The Third Rome was done by her pawns and proxies in the Cold War period from 1947 to 1991. 30 years following the Russian Revolution of 1917 to her victory in World War II over Nazi Germany in 1945, and then to her world conquests and domination involving her communists, proxies and allies from the 1950s onwards until the Cold War was reignited again in the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, called Special Operation by President Putin to denazify the independent nation of Ukraine, which was hoping to join the EU and NATO soon, in a move which would challenge the power and threaten the existence of the Red Beast itself. The Cold War has been ignited once again after it started on the 24th of February 2022's Russians' invasion of her own original motherland, the Kievan Rus in the Ukraine, which was an ironic move by the Russian bear. The red beasts, pawns and proxies in the Cold War, also called the undeclared war to dominate and control the entire world under Marxist-Leninist socialist communist ideology and Soviet puppets government, which ended in overwhelming victory for many, like in China, North Korea, North and South Vietnam, Laos and Kampuchea or Cambodia, but suffered decisive defeats in a few countries like Indonesia and British Malaya due to the West containment of the domino theory from coming into effect successfully. They were from right up down to the left. 1. Chairman Mao Zedong, December 26, 1893 to September 9, 1976, was a Chinese communist revolutionary who was the founder of the People's Republic of China, PRC, which he ruled in 1949 until his death in 1976. Ideologically a Marxist-Leninist, his theories, military strategies, and political policies are collectively known as Maoism. His CPC or Communist Party of China was the de facto single-party government that ruled Red China for over 70 years since it declared its independence on the 1st of October 1949. He was the first chairman of the CPC from March 20, 1943 until his death on September 9, 1976. 2. The Great Leader, Kim Il-sung's and his Workers' Party of Korea or WPK, the de facto single-party regime, and the Kim's dynasty inherited by his son, the dear leader Kim Jong-il, and now his grandson Kim Jong-un, the dear respected leader or the Marshal, the dynasty that have ruled communist North Korea for over 70 years ever since Kim Il-sung became the first premier of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea or DPRK on the 9th of September 1948 and the first chairman of the WPK on 24 June 1949 and later its secretary General on the 12th of October 1966 until his death on the 8th of July 1994. 3. Ho Chi Minh, the 19th of May 1890 to the 2nd of September 1969, whose real name was Nguyen Sinh Kung, but was also known as Nguyen Tap Ton, Nguyen Ari Quoc, Bac Ho, Ngoy Cha Dan Tok, meaning the father of the people or simply Bac, which means uncle. Ho was a Vietnamese Marxist, Leninist revolutionary and statesman. His Communist Party of Vietnam or CPV, founded by him on the 3rd of February 1930, over 90 years ago, is again the sole legal single party that had ruled North Vietnam and later South Vietnam when it reunited with the North after the fall of Saigon and the South on the 30th of April 1975. Uncle Ho was the first Prime Minister and President of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam or DRV from the 2nd of February 1945 until his death on the 2nd of September 1969. 4. Khe Son Promvahane, the 13th of December 1920 to the 21st of November 1992. A Marxist-Leninist revolutionary, was the first leader of the Communist Lao People's Revolutionary Party or LPRP from the 22nd of March 1955 until his death in the 21st of November 1992. After the Patha Lao or Communist Party of Laos seized power in the wake of the Laotian Civil War and abolished the 600-years-old monarchy of the Kingdom of Laos, when his paid Lao forces entered Vientiane, the capital, on the 23rd of August 1975. Forcing the last king, Sisavang Vattana, to abdicate and later exiling and imprisoning the entire royal family. He was the de facto leader of Laos from 1975, serving as the first Prime Minister of the Lao People's Democratic Republic from 1975 to 1991 and then as the second president from 1991 to his death in 1992. 5. Mengistu Haile Mariam, born on the 21st of May 1937 and still alive today, aged 83, as of April 2022, was an Ethiopian Marxist-Leninist revolutionary, a former army officer or lieutenant colonel and politician who was the head of state of Ethiopia from 1977 to 1991 and General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Ethiopia or WP from 1984 to 1991. As head of the socialist military junta, he overthrew the monarchy of Emperor Haile Selassie I on the 12th of September 1974 and killed the last emperor. He then governed Ethiopia as chairman of the Derg or Provisional Military Administrative Council, PMAC, from 1974 to 1987. Mengistu then became the president of the People's Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, PDIE, from 1987 to 1991 as a communist state and an ally of the Soviet Union until he was deposed by the rival rebel forces of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front or EPRDF, also Marxist-Leninist, and forced to flee on the 21st of May 1991 to Zimbabwe via Kenya, where he was granted asylum in Zimbabwe, former Rhodesia or South Africa, having served as their war advisor to the guerrilla fighters during the Rhodesian Bush War by providing training and arms, and after the war, he had provided training for Zimbabwean Air Force pilots. His regime, due to war and drought, was responsible for the famine of Ethiopia from 1983 to 1985, the worst famine to hit the country in a century, which affected 7.75 million people, out of Ethiopia's 38 to 40 million, or about 20% of its population, and left approximately 300,000 to 1.2 million dead. About 2.5 million people were internally displaced, whereas 400,000 refugees left Ethiopia, and almost 200,000 children were orphaned due to his government's mismanagement. And he is guilty of the Red Terror which he unleashed on political opponents. Some experts believe hundreds of thousands of university students, intellectuals, and politicians, including Emperor Haile Selassie himself, were killed during Mengistu's rule. Amnesty International estimates that a total of 500,000 people were killed during the Red Terror of 1977 and 1978. Human Rights Watch describes the Red Terror as one of the most systematic uses of mass murder by a state ever witnessed in Africa. During his reign, it was not uncommon to see students, suspected government critics, or rebel sympathizers hanging from lampposts each morning. Mengistu himself is alleged to have murdered opponents by garroting or shooting them, saying that he was leading by example. Estimates of the number of deaths for which he was responsible range from 500,000 to over 2 million people. Following an appeal on the 26th of May 2008, Mengistu was sentenced to death in absentia by Ethiopia's High Court, overturning his previous sentence of life imprisonment. 23 of his most senior aides also received death sentences that were commuted on the 1st of June 2011. As of the 4th of October 2011, 16 former Mengistu officials have been released from prison on parole, due to their old age and good behavior while incarcerated. However, Mengistu's sentence remained unchanged even though he was granted political asylum in Zimbabwe, which would not extradite him because of the key and commendable role he played during Rhodesia's struggle for independence. Mohammed Turaki, the 14th of July 1917 to the 8th of October 1979, was an Afghan Marxist, Leninist revolutionary communist politician, journalist, and writer. He was a founding member of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, who served as its General Secretary from 1965 to 1979 and Chairman of the Revolutionary Council from 1978 to 1979. In April 1978, the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, seized power in a bloody coup d'etat against then-President Mohammed Daoud Khan, in what is called the CZARS Revolution. The PDPA declared the establishment of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, with its first leader named as People's Democratic Party General Secretary Nur Mohammad Turaki. Hafizullah Amin, the 1st of August 1929 to the 27th of December 1979, was the main organizer of the April 1978 CZARS Revolution, which overthrew the government of President and Prince Mohammed Daoud Khan, who had earlier overthrew his cousin, the last King Mohammad Zahir Shah, in a coup in 1973 and abolished the 42-years-old Afghan monarchy which ruled from 1931 to 1973. Establishing it as a republic with himself as the first president. Nur Mohammad Turaki then formed a pro-Soviet state based on socialist ideals. Being second-in-chief of the Democratic Republic, Amin soon became the regime's strongman, the main architect of the state's programs including mass persecution of those deemed counter-revolutionary. A growing personal struggle with General Secretary Turaki eventually led to Amin wresting power away, then successfully deposing him and later ordering his execution. On September 16, 1979, Amin named himself chairman of the Council of Ministers, head of government, chairman of the Revolutionary Council, head of state, and General Secretary of the PDPA Central Committee, or the Supreme Leader. The Soviet Union under Leonid Brezhnev was dissatisfied with and mistrusted Armin's leadership, which featured controversies from beginning to end. His government failed to solve the problem of the population revolting against the regime as the situation rapidly worsened and army desertions and defections continued. The Red Beast of the Soviet Union intervened in Afghanistan by invading it, invoking the 1978 20-year Treaty of Friendship between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. Soviet operatives assassinated Armin at the Taj Beg Palace on the 27th of December 1979 as part of Operation Storm 333, kickstarting the 10-year Soviet-Afghan War. He had ruled for slightly longer than 3 months and was replaced by a Soviet puppet, Bayrak Kamel. Bayrak Kamel, the 6th of January 1929, 1 or the 3rd of December 1996, whose real name was Sultan Hussein, was an Afghan Marxist, Leninist revolutionary and politician who was the leader of Afghanistan, serving in the post of General Secretary of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan for 7 years from the 27th of December 1979 to the 4th of May 1986. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union deposed Kamel in 1986 and replaced him with Mohammad Najibullah. Mohammad Najibullah Ahadzai, the 6th of August 1947 to the 27th of September 1996, commonly known as Dr. Najib, was an Afghan Marxist, Leninist politician who served as the General Secretary of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA, the leader of the one-party ruling Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, or DI, from 1986 to 1992, and as well as the President of Afghanistan from 1987 until his resignation in April 1992, shortly after which the Mujahideen took over Kabul. After a failed attempt to flee to India, Najibullah remained in Kabul. He lived in the United Nations headquarters until his assassination by the Taliban after their capture of the city. 7. Sukarno, the 6th of June 1901 to the 21st of June 1970, whose Javanese name was Koesno Susrodiharjo, was an Indonesian statesman, orator, revolutionary, and nationalist who was the first president of Indonesia, serving from 1945 to 1967. The early 1960s saw Sukarno veering Indonesia to the left by providing support and protection to the Communist Party of Indonesia, PKI, the largest political party in Indonesia, to the irritation of the military and Islamists. He also embarked on a series of aggressive foreign policies under the rubric of anti-imperialism, with aid from the Soviet Union and China, thus favoring the rise of the PKI. Despite the appearances of unchallenged control, Sukarno's guided democracy stood on fragile grounds due to the inherent conflict between its two underlying support pillars, the military and the communists. The military, nationalists, and the Islamic groups were shocked by the rapid growth of the Communist Party under Sukarno's protection. They feared an imminent establishment of a communist state in Indonesia. By 1965, the PKI had 3 million members and were particularly strong in Central Java and Bali. PKI had become the strongest party in Indonesia. The military and nationalists were growing wary of Sukarno's close alliance with Communist China, which they thought compromised Indonesia's sovereignty. Elements of the military disagreed with Sukarno's policy of confrontation with Malaysia, which in their view only benefited communists, and sent several officers, including future Armed Forces Chief Leonidas Benjamin Mordani, to spread secret peace feelers to the Malaysian government. The Islamic clerics, who were mostly landowners, felt threatened by PKI's land confiscation actions, aksi sepihak, in the countryside and by the communist campaign against the 7 village devils, a term used for landlords or better-off farmers, similar to the anti-kulak campaign in Stalinist era. Both groups harbored deep disdain for PKI, in particular due to memories of the bloody 1948 communist rebellion. As the mediator of the 3 groups under the Nazarcom system, Sukarno displayed greater sympathies to the communists. The PKI had been very careful to support all of Sukarno's policies. Meanwhile, Sukarno saw the PKI as the best organized and ideologically solid party in Indonesia, and a useful conduit to gain more military and financial aid from communist bloc countries. Sukarno also sympathized with the communists' revolutionary ideals, which were similar to his own. To weaken the influence of the military, Sukarno rescinded martial law, which gave wide-ranging powers to the military, in 1963. In September 1962, he promoted the powerful General Nasushin to the less influential position of Armed Forces Chief, while the influential position of Army Chief was given to Sukarno's loyalist Ahmed Yani. Meanwhile, the position of Air Force Chief was given to Omar Dani, who was an open communist sympathizer. Tensions between the military and communists increased in April 1965, when PKI Chairman Adit called for the formation of a fifth armed force consisting of armed peasants and labor. Sukarno approved this idea and publicly called for the immediate formation of such a force on the 17th of May 1965. However, Army Chief Ahmed Yani and Defense Minister Nasushin procrastinated in implementing this idea, as this was tantamount to allowing the PKI to establish its own armed forces. Soon afterwards, on the 29th of May, the Gilchrist letter appeared. The letter was supposedly written by the British ambassador Andrew Gilchrist to the Foreign Office in London, mentioning a joint American and British attempt on subversion in Indonesia with the help of local army friends. This letter, produced by Subandrio, aroused Sukarno's fear of a military plot to overthrow him, a fear which he repeatedly mentioned during the next few months. The Czechoslovakian agent Ladislav Bittman, who defected in 1968, claimed that his agency, STB, forged the letter on request from PKI via the Soviet Union, to smear anti-communist generals. On his Independence Day speech of the 17th of August 1965, Sukarno declared his intention to commit Indonesia to an anti-imperialist alliance with China and other communist regimes and warned the army not to interfere. He also stated his support for the establishment of a fifth force of armed peasants and labor. After the events surrounding the 30th of September movement of 1965, the military general Suharto largely took control of the country and destroyed the PKI with executions of its members and sympathizers in several massacres, with support from the CIA and British intelligence services, resulting in an estimated 500,000 to over 1 million deaths. In 1967, Suharto assumed the presidency, replacing Sukarno, who remained under house arrest in Bogor Palace until his death on the 21st of June 1970 at age 69. The 30th of September movement 1965. On the dawn of the 1st of October 1965, 6 of Indonesia's most senior army generals were kidnapped and murdered by a movement calling themselves the 30th of September movement, G30S. Among those killed was Ahmed Yani, while Nasushin narrowly escaped, but the movement kidnapped First Lieutenant Pierre Tendine, his adjutant, presumably mistaking him for General Nasushin in the darkness. The G30S consisted of members of the Presidential Guards, Brawijaya Division, and Diponegoro Division, under the command of a Lieutenant Colonel Untung bin Shamsuri. The movement took control of the RI radio station and Merdeka Square. They broadcast a statement declaring the kidnappings were meant to protect Sukarno from a coup attempt by CIA-influenced generals. Later, it broadcast news of the disbandment of Sukarno's cabinet, to be replaced by a revolutionary council. In Central Java, soldiers associated with the G30S also seized control of Yogyakarta and Solo on 1–2 October, killing 2 colonels in the process. Major General Suharto, commander of the Military Strategic Reserve Command, took control of the army the following morning. Suharto ordered troops to take over the RI radio station and Merdeka Square itself. On the afternoon of that day, Suharto issued an ultimatum to the Halim Air Force Base, where the G30S had based themselves and where Sukarno, Air Marshal Omar Dani, and PKI Chairman Adit had gathered. By the following day, it was clear that the incompetently organized and poorly coordinated coup had failed. Sukarno took up residence in the Bogor Palace, while Omar Dani fled to East Java and Adit to Central Java. By the 2nd of October, Suharto's soldiers occupied Halim Air Force Base, after a short gunfight. Sukarno's obedience to Suharto's 1st of October ultimatum to leave Halim is seen as changing all power relationships. Sukarno's fragile balance of power between the military, political Islam, communists, and nationalists that underlay his guided democracy was now collapsing. On the 3rd of October, the corpses of the kidnapped generals were discovered near the Halim Air Force Base, and on the 5th of October they were buried in a public ceremony led by Suharto. In early October 1965, a military propaganda campaign began to sweep the country, successfully convincing both Indonesian and international audiences that it was a communist coup, and that the murders were cowardly atrocities against Indonesian heroes since those who were shot were veteran military officers. However, the Communist Party of Indonesia PKI's denials of involvement had little effect. Following the discovery and public burial of the generals' corpses on the 5th of October, the army along with Islamic organizations Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama led a campaign to purge Indonesian society, government, and armed forces of the Communist Party and other leftist organizations. Leading PKI members were immediately arrested, some summarily executed. Aidit was captured and killed in November 1965. The purge spread across the country with the worst massacres in Java and Bali. In some areas, the army organized civilian groups and local militias. In other areas, communal vigilante action preceded the army. The most widely accepted estimates are that at least 500,000 were killed. It is thought that as many as 1.5 million were imprisoned at one stage or another. As a result of the purge, one of Sukarno's 3 pillars of support, the Indonesian Communist Party, had been effectively eliminated by the other 2, the military and political Islam. The killings and the failure of his tenuous revolution distressed Sukarno, and he tried unsuccessfully to protect the PKI by referring to the generals' killings as a ripple in the sea of the revolution. 8. Alfonso Masambadabat, February 11, 1921 to March 25, 1977, who became the President of the Republic of the Congo in 1963, was the first African head of state who proclaimed himself openly a Marxist. He established a single-party system in 1964 around his own political group, the National Revolution Movement, Mouvement National de la Révolution, in French or MNR. Masambadabat was elected Secretary General of the National Revolution Movement while Ambrose Numazalai became its first secretary. The Congolese single party was backed by a well-armed popular militia, the Defense TUBAL, headed by Andy Diawara. However, by 1968 mounting protests led Masambadabat to imprison one of its leaders, Captain Marian Guabi. Seeing that the militant leftist opposition was not giving up, Masambadabat ended up yielding and proclaimed an amnesty, freeing Marian Guabi, among other political prisoners in mid-1968. Following the amnesty, Masambadabat relinquished his power in September, giving way to a period of instability. Finally, on the 31st of December 1968, Marian Guabi became the head of state. The new leader officially proclaimed a socialist-oriented state in the form of a popular republic on the 31st of December 1969. The administration became strongly centralized in Brazzaville and the main government posts were taken over by Congolese Workers' Party, Part 1 Congolais du Travail, PCT, cadres after abolishing the National Assembly of the previous republic. The Marxist-Leninist PCT held a constitutive congress in the capital from 29 to the 31st of December 1969, becoming the sole party of the new state. Marian Guabi further introduced a number of communist policies, such as nationalizing the means of production, in the succeeding years. Guabi was assassinated in 1977 and was succeeded by Colonel Joachim Yombiapango, who ruled until February 1979, when Denis Sassou Nguesso rose to power. In the same manner as other African communist states of the Cold War era, the People's Republic of the Congo shared close ties with the Soviet Union. This association remained strong after Guabi's assassination in 1977. 9. Chimpeng, the 21st of October 1924 to the 16th of September 2013, whose real name Ong Boon-hua, was a Malayan communist politician, steeped in Marxist-Leninist Maoist communist ideology and armed struggle, anti-fascist activist, and longtime leader of Malayan Communist Party, MCP, and the Malayan National Liberation Army, MNLA. During World War II, He fought as an anti-fascist guerrilla fighter in the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army or EMPRESSES against the Japanese occupation of Malaya. A determined anti-colonialist, he led the party's guerrilla insurgency in the Malayan Emergency, 1948 to 1960, fighting against British and Commonwealth forces in an attempt to establish an independent socialist state. After the CPM's defeat by the British declaring the Malayan Emergency and the successful implementation of the Briggs Plan of forced relocation of the Chinese sympathizers to new villages which cut off the bandits, as they were called by the British, food supplies, and the subsequent Malayan independence in 1957. Chin Peng waged a second unsuccessful campaign, 1968 to 1989, from exile in China and Thailand against the newly formed government of Malaysia in an attempt to replace its government with a socialist one. This second insurgency came to an end with the peace agreement of Hat Yoi 1989. Chin Peng died at the age of 88, in Bangkok, Thailand, seeing his dream of a Red Malaya vanished and the Red Communist domino predicted by the US for the rest of Southeast Asia stopped by the tenacity and intelligence of the British, his former ally in battle against the Japanese invasion of Malaya. 10. Pol Pot, whose real name was Saloth Sa, the 19th of May 1925 to the 15th of April 1998, was a Cambodian Marxist-Leninist Maoist revolutionary and politician who governed Cambodia as Prime Minister of Democratic Kampuchea between 1976 and 1979. Ideologically a Marxist, Leninist and a Khmer nationalist, he was a leading member of Cambodia's communist movement, the Khmer Rouge, which was pro-China based, from 1963 until 1997 and served as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Kampuchea or CPK from 1963 to 1981. Under his administration, Cambodia was converted into a de facto or one-party communist state and perpetrated the Cambodian genocide or the killing fields with the most inhuman torture and mass massacres the world has ever seen since the Holocaust of Nazi Germany in World War II. It is estimated that 1.671 million to 1.871 million Cambodians died as a result of Khmer Rouge policy, or between 21% and 24% of Cambodia's 1975 population. But according to a 2001 academic source, the most widely accepted estimates of excess deaths under the Khmer Rouge range might be from 1.5 million to 2 million. However, it is estimated by some demographer that between 1.17 million and 3.42 million Cambodians died unnatural deaths between 1970 and 1979, with between 150,000 and 300,000 of those deaths occurring during the Civil War, a total of which 1.4 million were the direct result of violence. Despite being based on a house-to-house survey of Cambodians, the estimate of the 3.3 million deaths was also promulgated by the Khmer Rouge successor regime, the People's Republic of Kampuchea, PRK, headed by Kampuchean United Front for National Salvation or FUNSK, which was pro-Vietnam and pro-Soviet. An estimated 300,000 Cambodians starved to death between 1979 and 1980. Largely as a result of the after-effects of Khmer Rouge policies. Fidel Castro, the 13th of August 1926 to the 25th of November 2016. Whose full name was Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz, was a Cuban revolutionary and politician and the leader of Cuba from 1959 to 2008, serving as the Prime Minister of Cuba from 1959 to 1976 and President from 1976 to 2008. Ideologically a Marxist, Leninist and Cuban nationalist, he also served as the first Secretary of the Party Communist of Cuba or PCC from 1961 until 2011. Under his administration, Cuba became a one-party communist state, industry and business were nationalized, and state socialist reforms were implemented throughout society. Castro adopted leftist and anti-imperialist ideas while studying law at the University of Havana. After participating in rebellions against right-wing governments in the Dominican Republic and Colombia, he planned the overthrow of Cuban President Fulgencio Batista, launching a failed attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953. After a year's imprisonment, Castro traveled to Mexico where he formed a revolutionary group, the 26th of July Movement, with his brother Raul Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara. Returning to Cuba, Castro took a key role in the Cuban Revolution by leading the movement in a guerrilla war against Batista's forces from the Sierra Maestra. After Batista's overthrow in 1959, Castro assumed military and political power as Cuba's prime minister. The United States came to oppose Castro's government and unsuccessfully attempted to remove him by assassination, economic embargo, and counter-revolution, including the Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961. Countering these threats, Castro aligned with the Soviet Union and allowed the Soviets to place nuclear weapons in Cuba, resulting in the Cuban Missile Crisis, a defining incident of the Cold War in 1962. Adopting a Marxist-Leninist model of development, Castro converted Cuba into a one-party, socialist state under Communist Party rule, the first in the Western Hemisphere. Policies introducing central economic planning and expanding healthcare and education were accompanied by state control of the press and the suppression of internal dissent. Abroad, Castro supported anti-imperialist revolutionary groups, backing the establishment of Marxist governments in Chile, Nicaragua, and Grenada, as well as sending troops to aid allies in the Yom Kippur, Ogaden, and Angolan civil war. These actions, coupled with Castro's leadership of the non-aligned movement from 1979 to 1983 and Cuba's medical internationalism, increased Cuba's profile on the world stage. Following the Soviet Union's dissolution in 1991, Castro led Cuba through the economic downturn of the special period, embracing environmentalist and anti-globalization ideas. In the 2000s, Castro forged alliances in the Latin American pink tide, namely with Hugo Chávez's Venezuela, and formed the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. In 2006, Castro transferred his responsibilities to Vice President Raul Castro, his brother, who was elected to the presidency by the National Assembly in 2008. The longest-serving non-royal head of state in the 20th and 21st centuries, Castro polarized opinion throughout the world. His supporters view him as a champion of socialism and anti-imperialism whose revolutionary government advanced economic and social justice while securing Cuba's independence from U.S. hegemony. Critics call him a dictator whose administration oversaw human rights abuses, the exodus of many Cubans, and the impoverishment of the country's economy. 12. Ernesto Che Guevara, which was his Spanish name, the 14th of June 1928 to the 9th of October 1967, was an Argentine Marxist revolutionary in Bolivia via Cuba, physician, author, guerrilla leader, diplomat, and military theorist. A major figure of the Cuban Revolution, his stylized visage has become a ubiquitous countercultural symbol of rebellion and global insignia in popular culture. As a young medical student, Guevara traveled throughout South America and was radicalized by the poverty, hunger, and disease he witnessed. His burgeoning desire to help overturn what he saw as the capitalist exploitation of Latin America by the United States prompted his involvement in Guatemala's social reforms under President Jacobo Arbenz, whose eventual CIA-assisted overthrow at the behest of the United Fruit Company solidified Guevara's political ideology. Later in Mexico City, Guevara met Raul and Fidel Castro, joined their 26th of July movement, and sailed to Cuba aboard the yacht Granma with the intention of overthrowing U.S.-backed Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Guevara soon rose to prominence among the insurgents, was promoted to second-in-command, and played a pivotal role in the two-year guerrilla campaign that deposed the Batista regime. Following the Cuban Revolution, Guevara performed a number of key roles in the new government. These included reviewing the appeals and firing squads for those convicted as war criminals during the revolutionary tribunals, instituting agrarian land reform as Minister of Industries, helping spearhead a successful nationwide literacy campaign, serving as both National Bank President and Instructional Director for Cuba's armed forces, and traversing the globe as a diplomat on behalf of Cuban socialism. Such positions also allowed him to play a central role in training the militia forces who repelled the Bay of Pigs invasion, and bringing Soviet nuclear-armed ballistic missiles to Cuba, which preceded the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Additionally, Guevara was a prolific writer and diarist, composing a seminal guerrilla warfare manual, along with a best-selling memoir about his youthful continental motorcycle journey. His experiences and studying of Marxism, Leninism led him to posit that the Third World's underdevelopment and dependence was an intrinsic result of imperialism, neocolonialism, and monopoly capitalism, with the only remedy being proletarian internationalism and world revolution. Guevara left Cuba in 1965 to foment continental revolutions across both Africa and South America, first unsuccessfully in Congo-Kinshasa and later in Bolivia, where he was captured by CIA-assisted Bolivian forces and summarily executed at the age of 39, a martyr of the communist world revolution. Guevara remains both a revered and reviled historical figure, polarized in the collective imagination in a multitude of biographies, memoirs, essays, documentaries, songs, and films. As a result of his perceived martyrdom, poetic invocations for class struggle, and desire to create the consciousness of a new man driven by moral rather than material incentives, Guevara has evolved into a quintessential icon of various leftist movements. In contrast, his ideological critics on the right accuse him of promoting authoritarianism and endorsing violence against his political opponents. Despite disagreements on his legacy, Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people of the 20th century, while an Alberto Corda photograph of him, titled Guerrillero Heroico, was cited by the Maryland Institute College of Art as the most famous photograph in the world. 13. Hugo Rafael Chávez Frías, which was his Spanish name, the 28th of July 1954 to the 5th of March 2013, a self-declared Marxist, was a Venezuelan politician who was president of Venezuela from 1999 until his death in 2013, except for a brief period in April 2002. Chávez was also leader of the Fifth Republic Movement political party from its foundation in 1997 until 2007, when it merged with several other parties to form the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, PSUV, which he led until 2012. Chávez became a career military officer and, after becoming dissatisfied with the Venezuelan political system based on the Punta Fijo Pact, he founded the clandestine revolutionary Bolivarian movement 200, MBR 200, in the early 1980s. Chávez led the MBR 200 in its unsuccessful coup d'état against the Democratic Action government of President Carlos Andrés Pérez in 1992, for which he was imprisoned. Pardoned from prison 2 years later, he founded the Fifth Republic Movement political party, and then receiving 56.2% of the vote, was elected president of Venezuela in 1998. He was re-elected in 2000 with 59.8% of the vote and again in 2006 with 62.8% of the vote. After winning his fourth term as president in the October 2012 presidential election with a decrease to 55.1% of the vote, he was to be sworn in on the 10th of January 2013. However, the inauguration was postponed due to his cancer treatment, and on the 5th of March 2013 at age 58, he died in Caracas. Following the adoption of a new constitution in 1999, Chávez focused on enacting social reforms as part of the Bolivarian Revolution. Using record high oil revenues of the 2000s, his government nationalized key industries, created participatory democratic communal councils and implemented social programs known as the Bolivarian missions to expand access to food, housing, healthcare, and education. The high oil profits coinciding with the start of Chávez's presidency resulted in temporary improvements in areas such as poverty, literacy, income equality, and quality of life between primarily 2003 and 2007, though extensive changes in structural inequalities did not occur. On the 2nd of June 2010, Chávez declared an economic war on Venezuela's upper classes due to shortages, arguably beginning the crisis in Venezuela. By the end of Chávez's presidency in the early 2010s, economic actions performed by his government during the preceding decade, such as deficit spending and price controls, proved to be unsustainable, with Venezuela's economy faltering. At the same time, poverty, inflation, and shortages increased. Under Chávez, Venezuela experienced democratic backsliding, as he suppressed the press, manipulated electoral laws, and arrested and exiled government critics. His use of enabling acts and his government's use of propaganda were controversial. Chávez's presidency saw significant increases in the country's murder rate and continued corruption within the police force and government. Internationally, Chávez aligned himself with the Marxist-Leninist governments of Fidel and then Raúl Castro in Cuba, as well as the socialist governments of Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. His presidency was seen as a part of the socialist pink tide sweeping Latin America. Chávez described his policies as anti-imperialist, being a prominent adversary of the United States' foreign policy as well as a vocal critic of neoliberalism and laissez-faire capitalism. He described himself as a Marxist. He supported Latin American and Caribbean cooperation and was instrumental in setting up the Pan-Regional Union of South American Nations, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, the Bank of the South and the regional television network TSARS. Chávez's ideas, programs, and style form the basis of Chavismo, a political ideology closely associated with Bolivarianism and socialism of the 21st century. Chávez was succeeded by Nicolás Maduro, born the 23rd of November 1962, the president of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela or PSUV since 2007 and assumed office as the president of Venezuela from the 5th of March 2013 until today as of April 2022, surviving assassination attempts and the election fraud controversies of 2013 and 2018. A 2018 Amnesty International report accused Nicolás Maduro's government of committing some of the worst human rights violations in Venezuela's history. The report found the violence was carried out especially in Venezuela's poor neighborhoods, and included 8,292 extrajudicial executions carried out between 2015 and 2017. In 1 year, 22% of homicides, 4,667, were committed by security forces. 14. José Daniel Ortega Saavedra, his name in Spanish, born the 11th of November 1945, is a Nicaraguan politician serving as president of Nicaragua since 2007. Previously, he was leader of Nicaragua from 1979 to 1990, first as coordinator of the Junta of National Reconstruction, 1979 to 1985, and then as president of Nicaragua, 1985 to 1990. A leader in the Sandinista National Liberation Front, Spanish, Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, FSLN, he implemented policies to achieve leftist reforms across Nicaragua. In later years, Ortega's previously left-wing radical politics moderated more and more, pursuing pro-business policies and even rapprochement with the Catholic Church, with the adoption of strong anti-abortion policies by his government in the 2000s, and adoption of strong religious rhetoric by the previously atheist Ortega. After the retirement of Fidel Castro in 2008, Ortega is one of the longest-serving non-royal rulers in the world and the longest-serving non-royal leader in the Americas. From an early age, Ortega opposed Nicaragua's dictator Anastasio Somoza Debayle, and became involved in the underground movement against his government. Joining the Sandinistas as a student in 1963, Ortega became involved with urban resistance activities and was arrested and imprisoned in 1967. Ortega, like many political prisoners of the Somoza regime, was tortured and abused in jail. Upon release in 1974, he was exiled to Cuba, where he received training in guerrilla warfare from Fidel Castro's Marxist-Leninist government. Ortega and his brother Humberto formed the insurrectionist, or Tercerista, Third Way, faction, which united the FSLN and sparked the mass uprisings of 1978 to 1979. Culminating in the Nicaraguan Revolution. After the overthrow and exile of Somoza Debaile's government, Ortega became leader of the ruling multipartisan Junta of National Reconstruction. In the 1984 Nicaraguan general election, Ortega won Nicaragua's disputed presidential election with over 60% of the vote as the FSLN's candidate. A Marxist-Leninist, Ortega pursued a program of nationalization, land reform, wealth redistribution, and the Nicaraguan literacy campaign during his first period in office. Ortega's relationship with the United States was never very cordial, as the US had long supported the Somoza family's dictatorship. Although the US initially supplied the ruined post-revolution Nicaragua with economic aid, relations quickly soured. His government was beset by violent opposition from US-backed rebels, best known as the Contras. This illegal intervention continued, albeit covertly, after Ortega's democratic election as president in 1984. Peace talks between 5 Central American heads of state in July 1987 led to the signing of the Central American Peace Accords, and the beginning of a roadmap to the end of the conflict. In 1988, the Contras first entered into peace talks with the Sandinista government, although the violence continued, as did their US support. Despite US opposition, disarmament of the Contras began in 1989. The US continued the economic embargo, promising to lift it if the Sandinistas were ousted in the election, providing financial support to the opposition candidate, and promising aid to Nicaragua should Violeta Chamorro be elected. After a difficult presidency marred by war and economic collapse, Ortega was defeated in the 1990 Nicaraguan general election by Violeta Chamorro. He continued to be an important figure in Nicaraguan opposition politics. Ortega was an unsuccessful candidate for president in 1996 and 2001 but won the 2006 Nicaraguan general election. In office, he made alliances with fellow Latin American socialists, such as Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. Under Ortega's leadership, Nicaragua joined the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. His second administration became increasingly anti-democratic, alienating many of his former revolutionary allies, some of whom compared him to Somoza, who they had overthrown. In June 2018, Amnesty International and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of the Organization of American States reported that Ortega had engaged in a violent oppression campaign against protesters in response to the anti-Ortega 2018 to 2021 Nicaraguan protests. The violent crackdown during 2018 protest and subsequent decrease of civil liberties have led to massive waves of migration to Costa Rica, with over 30,000 Nicaraguans filing for asylum in that neighboring country. Repression against his political opponents increased in 2021. His government jailed many of his potential rivals in the 2021 Nicaraguan general election, including Cristiana Chamorro Barrios, daughter of former President Violeta Chamorro de Barrios. Ortega's government imprisoned others who opposed him, including former allies Dora Maria Tellez and Hugo Torres Jimenez. In August 2021, Nicaragua cancelled the operating permits of 6 US and European NGOs. Many critics of the Ortega government, including opposition leaders, journalists, and members of civil society, fled the country in mid-20s after his 2021 re-election. Joe Biden banned the president from entering the United States. 15. Antonio Agostinho da Silva Neto, the 17th of September 1922 to the 10th of September 1979, was an Angolan revolutionary politician and poet. He served as the first president of Angola from 1975 to 1979, having led the popular movement for the liberation of Angola, MPLA, in the War for Independence, 1961 to 1974. Until his death, he led the MPLA in the Civil War, 1975 to 2002. Known also for his literary activities, he is considered Angola's preeminent poet. His birthday is celebrated as National Heroes Day, a public holiday in Angola. Neto attended high school in the capital city, Luanda. His parents were both school teachers and Methodists. His father, also called Agostinho Neto, was a Methodist pastor. After secondary school he worked in the colonial health services before going on to university. The younger Neto left Angola for Portugal, and studied medicine at the universities of Coimbra and Lisbon. He combined his academic life with covert political activity of a revolutionary sort, and PIDE, the security police force of the Estado Novo regime headed by Portuguese Prime Minister Salazar, arrested him in 1951 for 3 months for his separatist activism. He was arrested again in 1952 for joining the Portuguese Movement for Democratic Youth Unity. He was arrested again in 1955 and held until 1957. He finished his studies, marrying a 23-year-old Portuguese woman who was born in Trás-os-Montes, Maria Eugenia da Silva, the same day he graduated. He returned to Angola in 1959, was arrested again in 1960, and escaped to assume leadership of the armed struggle against colonial rule. When Angola gained independence in 1975, he became president and held the position until his death in 1979. In December 1956, the Angolan Communist Party, PCA, merged with the Party of the United Struggle for Africans in Angola, PLUA, to form the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or MPLA, with Viriato da Cruz, the president of the PCA, as Secretary General and Neto as president. The Portuguese authorities in Angola arrested Neto on the 8th of June 1960. His patients and supporters marched for his release from Bengo to Catipe, but was stopped when Portuguese soldiers shot at them, killing 30 and wounding 200 in what became known as the Massacre of Icalo e Bengo. At first, Portugal's government exiled Neto to Cape Verde. Then, once more, he was sent to jail in Lisbon. After international protests were made to Salazar's administration urging Neto's release, Neto was freed from prison and put under house arrest. From this he escaped, going first to Morocco and then to Congo Leopoldville. In 1962, Neto visited Washington, D.C. and asked the Kennedy administration for aid in his war against Portugal. The U.S. government turned him down, because it had oil interests in colonial Angola, choosing instead to support Holden Roberto's comparatively anti-communist National Liberation Front of Angola, FNLA. Neto met Che Guevara in 1965 and began receiving support from Cuba. He visited Havana many times, and he and Fidel Castro shared similar Marxist-Leninist ideological views. Following the Carnation Revolution in Portugal during April 1974, which deposed Salazar's successor Marcelo Caetano, three political factions vied for Angolan power. One of the three was the MPLA, to which Neto belonged. On the 11th of November 1975, Angola achieved full independence from the Portuguese, and Neto became the nation's ruler after the MPLA, with the help of Castro's Cuban troops, seized Luanda at the expense of the other anti-colonial movements like the National Front for the Liberation of Angola, or FNLA, and the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, or UNITA. He established a one-party state, and his government developed close links with the Soviet Union and other nations in the Eastern Bloc and other communist states, particularly Cuba, which aided the MPLA considerably in its war with the FNLA, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, and South Africa. Neto made the MPLA declare Marxism-Leninism its official doctrine. As a consequence, he violently repressed a movement later called fractionism, which in 1977 attempted a coup d'état inspired by the Organização dos Comunistas de Angola. In December 1977, at their first Congress, they changed their name to MPLA-PT, MPLA Partido do Trabalho, officially adopting the Marxist-Leninist ideology, requested by Neto Alves. Tens of thousands of followers, or alleged followers, of Neto Alves were executed in the aftermath of the attempted coup, over a period that lasted up to 2 years, although Agostinho Neto only ratified the death sentence of Neto Alves. After corresponding with several relatives of the disappeared, Neto decided to dissolve DISA for the excesses they had committed. Neto died in a hospital in Moscow, while undergoing surgery for cancer, shortly before his 57th birthday. José Eduardo dos Santos succeeded him as president. The Angolan civil war between MPLA and UNITA continued to rage for almost a quarter of a century more, from 1975 to 2002. The Civil War was one of the most prominent Cold War proxy wars, with UNITA receiving military aid initially from People's Republic of China from 1966 until October 1975, and FNLA from the United States and apartheid South Africa, while the MPLA received support from the Soviet Union and its allies, especially Cuba. These 15 nations that have embraced Marxist-Leninism or Marxist-Maoism as their political and sociological ideology and attempted a de facto one-party rule which is often autocratic, despotic, and dictatorial in the world, to the misery, death, massacre, ruin and destruction of many innocent people during the Cold War and today are just a few examples of the satanic and deceptive power of the false gospel of Karl Marx's offer of a fair, just and equal socialist society resulting on a false utopia. Or heaven on earth, promising its adherents a better life here on earth for the poor and oppressed in an unjust capitalistic society achievable despite the odds and impossible by armed struggles and the overthrowing of legitimate democratic governments of the rich bourgeois class. There are many more not listed here like Mozambique, Guinea, Benin, Sudan, Nepal, etc. and etc. in this slide due to space constraint but will mentioned in the later slides.